Welcome to the Becoming Aware podcast, where I, Genevieve Faulkner, share what I'm becoming aware of. Hello and welcome to the Becoming Aware podcast. My name is Genevieve Faulkner, your host, and if you're watching this on YouTube, hi. So first of all, I just wanted to apologize. I've not been keeping up with my episodes. I've had someone close to me be quite sick and had complications after surgery for a couple of months actually. So there's just been some added things in my life that I've had to take care of, which means that when it comes to social media stuff, I dropped the ball a little bit. So things are looking better, thank God. So hopefully from now on, my efforts will be a little bit more consistent and regular. That kind of ties into what I wanted to talk about today, because I wanted to talk about healing. Sometimes the path to healing doesn't quite look the way we think it's going to look. There is a process in healing anything, and we can get into this mindset sometimes that it's going to look a certain way, and it's not always the case. So I wanted to talk about that, and I'm hoping that this is going to contribute to anyone that needs to perhaps understand this process a little bit more. First of all, I just kind of, as I have mentioned before, we have all of these data within our subconscious, and that contributes to creating our reality. And within that data, there is so many different points of view that we have about healing based upon the things that we've been taught, based upon the experiences that we've had. And when I say experiences, I mean like as multi-dimensional beings, I mean the lifetimes we've had where we've had all of these different experiences being different kinds of healers, and the points of view that we created in those lifetimes and our ancestors created based upon the modalities that we were using at the time. So we can think that we're functioning in this, kind of linear way of what we consciously are aware of with our mind, thinking that this is the way it's going to be. And yet there's so much beneath the surface that can be connected to the experience that we create. Sometimes that's because there's some things unresolved from those lifetimes that are being created in a way or contributing to creating the reality that we're experiencing, so that energy gets dissolved or looked at or released. And sometimes it's just the way that it is. So one of the things that you can kind of be a little curious about or being questioned about is what are the points of view that you have about healing. When in the theta healing courses, it's one of the things that sometimes we get people to do digging work on is what are the points of view, that people have about healing. And people can have beliefs like healing is painful. Healing is a slow process. It takes time to heal. Like these kinds of things actually begins to create the reality, right? And so sometimes there can be elements of, when I do sessions with people, there will be some people that will have less of those kinds of points of view, like particularly around time. And they may receive so much transformation and change really quickly because there isn't that kind of, information system within their subconscious that is slowing that process down. Others will have those points of view of healing taking time. And so it might be that there's kind of like this process after a session that may be days, it could be weeks, where they are slowly integrating the energy and the downloads and the information that they're receiving in a way that their subconscious can process it. Neither is right or wrong, right? In a way, it kind of there's an element with that, like the more out of control someone's willing to be, the more they're going to be able to speed up that change. Yet that speed of change for some people is too much to happen, quickly, because if you look at what healing is, right, that can be a complete metamorphosis. It can be a complete transformation. You can become a different person when you heal something effectively, you create a different identity. People can create identities around illness, sickness, wounds, victimization, and then they can create an identity based upon who they are when they've changed all of that, because they no longer have to hold any of that as part of their identity. And so sometimes there are people that, like, that reality leap is a little bit too much to have instantaneously. They need that process to be a little slowed down. So the control elements are in place within their subconscious in order to create that ease, so to speak, with where they're at on their journey. Every single person is different. Every single person. And when I do sessions on people, there will be, I'll get a sense of like whether or not there is resistance or whether or not there's some control programs, and whether or not it's going to be a little bit of an unfolding process, or whether or not they're really receiving in that moment and it's all shifting and changing to a degree. Yet there is also an element of any kind of energy work. It's very much between the person and the universe, right? Because they are the ones creating their reality. The channeler or the witness of the change is part of the process, but really ultimately the healing that's occurring is, between the person and their God, so to speak, or that energy, that flow, what it is that they're really seeking and creating. The way that I see things with theta healing is, which is the method that I use, is, time in that method, because we're going into the subconscious mind and we're connecting to that energy of, the oneness of everything. Time doesn't really exist in the same way. So we're kind of accessing different times and spaces and realities when we're doing a session. And because of that, it's kind of like you can bring in different energy to somebody's subconscious. But if they've got some control programs or some kind of like points of view that create that need for there to be this time sequence with the healing, then they'll receive what they need to receive with those downloads when they're willing to receive it, when it's their time. But in my mind, I'll see it done, right? Because I'm tapping into the future where they have received it. I don't need to be present with them for that whole journey, because it's not really my journey to have. What's required is their kind of willingness to go on that journey in order for that to unfold. So one of the things that can block healing is, or that can slow healing down, as I've mentioned, is the control programs that we have. So the need to be in control, and all of the defense mechanisms that someone's subconscious creates in order to maintain that control. Now, control isn't a bad thing. Control is part of a way we keep ourselves safe. The problem is with people's subconscious minds, though, sometimes they have created this structure within their energetic fields that is working against them. So they've gone into hypervigilance based upon the experiences that they've had, based upon the trauma that they're carrying. And as a result, they've learned not to let anyone in, or they've learned receiving from people isn't safe, right? And so when somebody's got something like that going on, there's this control structure in place that means that when you go to facilitate healing for them, what they're going to receive, if they're misidentifying that healing as being something that's coming from a person instead of coming from the universe, something that's being channeled through and is actually from universal energy and not effectively the person, then they're going to shut it down. They're going to resist receiving, right? This will happen sometimes when people have had abuse, when they've had traumatic experiences. It is changeable. It is changeable, and it just means that sometimes when working on people, like I'll often perceive it if somebody's got something like that going on. And it just means that no matter what it is that they're wanting to work on, that's going to be the thing that has to be worked on first. their willingness to receive, their ability to trust that they can trust the universe enough to allow that energy to come into their system and change things. If you don't work on that first, nothing else is going to go in, right? Or very little is going to go in, because they've got that point of view that they've got to defend or fight against people or women or men or, whatever it is, that's keeping that defense mechanism in place. So in theta healing, there's a process that we can do, which is, sometimes it's kind of like they just need the information, the energetic download that they are, what true healing is, and that they know how to know the difference between receiving a healing and from the universe and whatever it is that they think is happening with the practitioner. Now, practitioners can sometimes have points of view, right? Obviously, we're all human, right? So healers are going to sometimes, they can sometimes have their own wounding. They can sometimes have things within a session that is influencing a session. So if a healer has a lot of projections, like they have a resistance to receiving the person's reality in some way, shape or form, or they haven't done the work on themselves in that particular area, and there's something that they're not willing to look at, then that will sometimes influence the healing as well, right? Because you can't actually take someone where you're not willing to go yourself. And so that is important to recognize, because if you're going to a healer and you're finding that there's something that's not quite gelling, maybe ask some questions about it. What is it? Is there some sort of resistance in this person's world? Are they willing to be vulnerable enough with themselves and do the work on themselves to be able to go to the depth of where I'm wanting to go? Or is there some sort of karmic thing going on? Sometimes there can be relationships between clients and healers where, they've known each other before, and there can be elements of, sometimes it ties into like witch wounds, where perhaps they've been particularly, and I'm speaking like in the energetic worlds, like, so particularly for energy healers, there might be clients that come that have known them, when they were doing all sorts of magics too. And so there can be occasionally karmic lessons between a client and a practitioner. So I just want to mention that too, because if you're watching this and you're a healer and you've got something going on with a client, you want to make sure that you're looking at whether or not there is something like karmic. So whether or not this is a soulmate client, whether or not they've shown up to teach you something, is there anything that they're mirroring? Is there anything that you need to shift and change within in order to be able to facilitate them in the way that is required to help them move forward? Sometimes, like with that, when I say karmic stuff, it can be that sometimes they might be showing up because, they're coming to facilitate some kind of healing. Other times it might be that they're coming to facilitate some sort of vendetta that they've got based upon some other lifetime. So there can be, all sorts of things going on beneath the surface. And it's important to acknowledge it all. So that, when you're willing to be aware of what is, then you can have ease with making the next choice, right? So moving on. So what's actually required for healing? First of all, you need to have a sense of safety enough. Now, I know that's, some of you are going to hear me say that and be like, well, how can I feel safe? I've got all of this trauma. That's what I'm going to a healer for. What I mean by that is that there has to be, first of all, like, as I mentioned, healers have their stuff, right? We are all able to perceive energy. So you'll be able to feel if a healer isn't able to really receive from you, right? You'll feel the judgment. You'll feel the dismissal. You'll feel the rejection. If there's any of that kind of energy, they're not going to necessarily be able to facilitate in the way that they could, or as dynamically as if they're actually open-hearted and kind of, just willing to be with you without any point of view, not have any judgment of your journey or what you've experienced or how you're handling it or any of that. So in order to feel safe to heal, if you're going to a healer, first of all, check that. Look at whether or not the person that you're choosing, are you choosing them because there's a sense of safety there? The reason why I say that is because sometimes we can have these things playing out where, just like in, other relationships, if we've got stuff that's unhealed with regards to one of our caregivers in childhood, we can sometimes choose healers that are similar to the person that we've got the wound with, right? And so we can think consciously that we're going to them to heal things, to receive all of this change. And yet what's actually occurring is we're going to them to repeat the pattern because they match what it is that we previously experienced. So notice how your body feels. Notice what you're aware of when you choose someone. I myself will choose someone that pops. Like if I need healing, I don't know how else to kind of describe that, but it's kind of like there are people that I have met on my journey that, like, I believe that I was kind of like, I was meant to meet. Like we set something up before we both got here, and it's kind of like that divine timing, synchronicity, boom, I'm going to meet you, I'm going to open this door kind of thing. When I've had those experiences with healers, there's this popping that occurs. There's this lightness. There's this kind of like loudness of energy of like, oh, that person, I know that if I go to that person, I'm going to receive something that's going to create like change for me. So I've had a number of those experiences. For me, that's what I look for when I go to a healer. It might be different to you. You might not have that kind of, way of functioning with awareness. And it might be that you just pay attention to how your body feels. Does your body feel safe? Do you feel safe? Do you feel cared for? Do you feel acknowledged when you have a session? If not, and healers can have a bad day too, but if not, is there something else at play here? What are the unconscious things that are going on beneath the surface with regards to why you are choosing to go to this person? So you have to have safety. When I'm talking about that, I'm not just talking about with the healer though. I'm also talking with regards to your own life. So you can't really create deep healing. This is just my point of view. Maybe I'm wrong. But you can't really create deep healing if you're not feeling safe and secure enough in yourself to be able to do the deep inner work. What do I mean by that? If I look at my own journey, for example, I came out of a marriage that was beautiful in many ways, but was also a very codependent one. And that meant I knew when I left that I had a lot of codependency wounds. Something that I have done, over the last, I think it's 5 years now, is remain single. I've remained single because I knew when I left that marriage that if I jumped into another relationship, I would end up repeating the same patterns. Even if I was to do the work, right? If I was going to work on myself and do healing, there would be patterns that would get repeated because of the way that I was functioning with my mindset. I would have merged with that other person, and then I wouldn't have necessarily been able to kind of like focus on myself enough to be able to kind of like get to the depth of the healing that I needed to do. And so it's kind of like that. Like if you're wanting to heal, but you're also choosing things that are against the healing, you're not creating a safe space for yourself to heal. So that's something that you need to look at when you're choosing, healing work, when you're choosing to actively begin that journey is okay, how am I going to support myself on this journey? How am I going to make sure that I'm safe? How am I going to make sure that I'm secure? It is really difficult also to do that deep healing stuff if, like you're in survival mode to a degree, right? So if your basic needs are not met, sometimes it might be that you need to slow that healing process down. It might be that you need to take care of the physical world, the physical reality, and make sure that, you've got a roof over your head, you've got enough money coming in, you've got, whatever else is required in order to feel safe within yourself, so that you can hold yourself through the process of moving forward. So that may be, sometimes we can decide, right, I want to heal this, and we want to heal it so fast. But sometimes it's the slowing down that's required, because there's other things that need to be put in place to be able to go to the depth of where you want to get to. So looking at whether or not you've got that safety, and looking at what is required in order to have that safety for yourself, have that security for yourself, looking at whether or not you're choosing relationships that are creating, some relationships in a healing journey are going to contribute to actually creating growth. Other relationships may be a destructive pattern that's playing out. So looking at the relationships that you have and beginning to create, in a sense, sometimes to create healing, sometimes we need to remove ourselves from the environment that created the wounding, right? So we need to create this kind of, I don't want to say bubble, but it is kind of like this different space to be able to create that sense of safety, right? If you haven't kind of allowed yourself that, and you're still in the energy of everything that was wounding you, then it's going to be harder to do the work or create the change sometimes that you're desiring. So are you secure enough in the physical world to be able to hold yourself? Responsibility plays a massive part in healing also. So there, on my journey as a healer, there has been a journey of kind of shifting the responsibility. I know in the beginning I had lots of programs around being a healer, and I had a lot of responsibility programs, and it meant that for a time, particularly when I first began as a business, doing healing as a business, I would attract people that would project that their healing was my responsibility. And it doesn't work like that. The healer is responsible for creating a space, for providing that service, for assisting you in your growth. But ultimately, our journey to heal is very much up to us, to make that commitment to ourselves. When there's that need to project that responsibility onto a healer, it's often coming from the inner child that's still wounded, right? So they're looking for a parent in the healer. They're looking for someone to provide the security that child needed. And part of the healing process, no matter what you're looking at, a lot of the times, it doesn't matter whether it's relationship, money problems, wanting to grow your business. A lot of the times, the place we go back to is that early childhood stuff. So, part of that journey of healing is the process of going beyond the needs of trying to find that person that's going to be that person for you, that's going to take care of that inner child, and being willing to step into the embodiment of being that adult for yourself. So there is a process in that. I don't want to create I guess I don't want anyone to misinterpret this and then to make themselves wrong if they've done that, or if they are needing that from someone, because there is this journey on a healing journey that for a time, it might be that there's elements where perhaps you do feel like you need that and you're seeking that from someone. And healers can provide different things, but it's also important that you be aware that there is a process in healing, and that willingness to step up at some point is what's required in order to really kind of transmute, change, transform, like whatever you want to say, like become who you were born to be, basically. There has to be also a willingness to be present enough to know what's required to heal and what action to take, right? Because healing is not right, I'm going to go to this session and this healer is going to take care of it all, and then everything's going to be better, and I don't have to do anything different now because I'm going to be healed. Sorry. Healing, part of the process of healing may be having healing sessions with someone, but the process of healing is also making different choices. It's the willingness to step up for yourself, and it's the willingness to look at what doesn't work, and it's the willingness to look at what is required in order to really allow yourself to thrive. And that's uncomfortable. And sometimes that means also, boundaries is part of that as well. That's something that I've most definitely had to learn, learning how to not always people please, not always put everybody first, actually kind of honor myself on the journey and know when to say no. And I know that is so, like, for anyone that's had a traumatic childhood or they've had traumatic relationships, codependent relationships where they've learnt to survive through merging with the other, like that is vital. Like really kind of being willing to take those actions to create the change and be present, right? Because if you're in avoidance of what's required, that's where you go into the dynamic of making somebody else responsible, wanting them to be responsible for the change, so that then you don't have to be present with the energy and what's actually required in order to change it. So one has to surrender to the process, much like with birth, right? So healing, to some, it can be, well, actually on a journey of healing, there can be moments of euphoria. There can be moments of lightness. I know that I myself, like on my journey, there have been times where I have like been just, it's like being on drugs, right? Like it's like you're so expanded and so light and just like this joy. It's amazing. But not every session or not every class or not every experience is going to create that. There has been other times where I don't even know how to describe, but I'll before a class or after a class, going to a healer, like there'll be this wave of just like horrible, like just like, oh my God, I feel like I'm back like 10 years and I'm back in something and this is horrible, right? That's part of the process sometimes too. And sometimes there can be a resistance to that in some people. So they can have some sort of session, they can have something like that occur where all of a sudden there's this intensity of energy, this intensity of motion, or this disconnection or trauma comes up. And sorry guys, I just had a knock at the door. So where were we? So sometimes people can have these experiences of having a healing session and then they've got all of this stuff that gets brought up after the session. And it can feel like perhaps they're not getting anywhere. But there is a reason why that is occurring. So one of the things that, creates that sometimes is when somebody has compartmentalized things within their subconscious. So they've created little boxes, little like bubbles of energy to be able to deal with what it is that they've experienced. So if they've had a traumatic childhood and there's lots of trauma there, then they can create these wounded child aspects that are holding on to the trauma. And then they've got this other part of themselves that is, more of the everyday functional adult, right? When there's healing work that gets done, sometimes that healing work is creating change in the part of themselves that they're willing to be, that is beginning to dissolve and dismantle the walls between who they think they are and the versions of them that they've separated from in order to be able to cope with what it is that they've experienced. And so as those walls begin to dissolve, that can create this place where the emotional energy that part of them has been holding begins to kind of, I want to say leak, into the conscious part of them. It begins to rise, it begins to surface so that it can actually be released. Now, this will often occur particularly with regards to when you're doing that deep healing work, with regards to perhaps the family dynamic, the childhood that you experienced, what it is that you were aware of that wasn't necessarily acknowledged in childhood. One of the things that keeps us stuck and trapped a lot of the time in our everyday life, not being able to create what we want, is when that kind of dynamic has occurred, where things have been suppressed beneath the surface, and the child, when they're kind of in an environment that isn't really safe, that may be volatile, that they've been perhaps abused in some way, their defense mechanism in that is basically either fawn, merge with the person or people and just take on their identity so that you're safe, or denial and create a kind of false sense of reality and disassociation, disconnect from reality and create sometimes a fantasy world or idealized version of who they have decided their caretakers are, in order to avoid the discomfort and the pain and the fear of who they're really living with and the points of view and the emotional energy that's there, right? It's not safe. As a child, we don't have the ability to remove ourselves from the situation. And so our minds create ways to cope. Now, as an adult, you have the ability to leave. You have the ability to create change in some way. And so it's different. But when you're doing that deep healing work and there's elements of your current reality being influenced by these wounded child aspects, and that having to be dealt with and released, but that meaning, part of that process is that you've got to be willing to go beyond the natural way of functioning within the family dynamic, to actually acknowledge what you were aware of that was unspoken and acknowledged by everyone else, meaning that you've got to be willing to look at the dark side of everybody that you were living with, the elements that made you feel unsafe as a child, that caused you to disconnect from yourself in the first place. And when you do that, when there's work done with a healer to actually get you to the place where you feel secure enough and safe enough to be able to look at that, wow, my mom had a lot of rage. She was really angry. Sometimes she had really mean thoughts about me, right? That kind of stuff. That's just an example. When you get to a place where it's safe, that's when those inner child, those wounded parts can actually speak, right? That's when they can actually begin to have their world acknowledged. That's when the pain can begin to dissolve. But the problem is, when you start to merge, when you start to break down that wall, when you start to acknowledge the truth of the reality, you've got all of that condensed energy that kind of starts to bleed into the rest of you. And then you've also got your own emotional response system in the present moment of being aware of what it is that you didn't want to be aware of at that time, right? And that can create all sorts of emotions also. And so there's this element of, and also as that is occurring, as that merging and that bleeding and that energy from the past that's been locked up for so long begins to kind of begins to have the permission to be seen in a way that allows it to begin to transmute. You get the feelings of everything that you felt sometimes. You get the feelings of everything that you felt as a child in that process. And so there can be this weird kind of experience that can occur of, on one hand, you're this adult that's functional, yet you're going through this journey of kind of becoming aware of things, and it's painful and there's all these feelings. But then there's also this element of this child part that felt completely overwhelmed, completely powerless, felt like it couldn't change anything. It didn't have a say. It didn't have a voice. This is all too much. I don't know how to change this. I don't know how to heal this, right? So there's an intensity of energy with that. And you can be flipping in between the two, because this is like part of the merge and part of the shift and part of the change. And this is where sometimes people will get a little stuck, okay? They'll go into resistance, and they'll go into resistance because they feel everything that child part of them felt. And then they misidentify in their minds that is what the current reality is. They don't realize that what it is that they're feeling is part of the process of shedding all of that energy, because you're finally acknowledging, whoa, this was reality. Whoa, a part of me has been locked up in this like my whole life. Whoa, that is intense, right? And so that's where there can be this disconnect and this disassociation and this wanting to run in the opposite direction and feeling like, you know, the healing's not working. The healing's not working because there's those feelings of feeling unsafe and afraid and overwhelmed, because that's how the inner child part of you felt perhaps on your journey, right? That part of, in a sense, it's almost like an initiation. And this doesn't happen for everybody, but this just happens for some people when they're going through this process. It's part of an initiation, the willingness to be totally present, the willingness to step up for that part of you, the willingness to acknowledge that right now is not the reality that you were in then, and that it's okay to feel all of that, because now you're the adult and you're going to take care of you. This is why I say that it's very important that there's this safety within your own world to be able to do that kind of deep inner work. You can't do that if you haven't got enough of a kind of stability, grounding, space within your own world physically to be able to kind of hold yourself in that, right? Because you've got to know that you are the adult in the room to be able to provide that stability, to be like, it's okay, I can hold this. It's like stepping into being a parent, right? As a parent, you can kind of have your own emotional experience going on. And yet if you're dealing with a young child that's got these really big feelings, you've got to be able to be a space that can facilitate them through that, even if you're having the worst day of your life, right? So in a sense, that's what's occurring within when you're going through this deep inner work, when you're willing to step into actually being like the parent for yourself and to hold that space, then there's a kind of like an ability that gets born of being able to know that you're okay and that you can move all of this energy because you've got you, right? You're not abandoning yourself. You're not running from yourself. Now, if you're not ready for that process, what will happen is there will be a place and space where perhaps you're going to feel like, the healing isn't working. It will feel too intense. If you're not ready for that process, that doesn't mean that it's not, something that you can do at some other point in time. It might be that it's not time for this work yet, right? So there's an element of looking at if you're finding that there is perhaps resistance coming up, ask yourself, am I actually able to hold myself in this process right now, or is something else required? Is there something within the physical world that I need to take care of first? Sometimes with that whole process, with the healing journey, there can be a resistance to actually fully healing because we're afraid of what we're going to have to choose after the healing, right? It might be like, oh my God, when I've taken care of this, then I'm going to have to make this really big choice, and I'm afraid of making the really big choice. So I'm just needing to sit in the healing and not change things so I don't have to make that big choice, right? If that's you, if you've had that experience, break down the choice a little bit, okay? Because that's like this subconscious kind of loop thing going on, but it doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes when we've got, when we make some sort of change significant, it makes it really difficult to go through that change. But if we can break down the steps of that, it's way less scary. So looking at or telling yourself, you know what, I can heal from this, and I can allow myself this kind of grace period and this space to be able to know what choices I can make, like in each moment, to bring myself forward in my journey without having to force myself to do something that I'm not ready for yet, right? Because like in the willingness to be present with yourself on the journey of healing, like that means caring. That means learning how to fully care for yourself. That means being willing to look at whether or not the choices that you're trying to force yourself to make are caring, and sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not, because you may require a little bit more time, and that's okay. So getting out of force, letting yourself acknowledge what you're ready for and what not, looking at the dynamics of, who you're choosing for a healer, and who you're not, and what's behind that choice, and whether or not they have the ability to take you where you want to go. If you aren't, so if you're not healing, you want to be looking at whether or not there is that need for staying in control. Ask yourself what that's really about. Is there a resistance to the future? What ways am I healing that I haven't acknowledged? So sometimes, as I've mentioned, that is an example of healing, but that healing not looking like people think it's going to look. And so sometimes we can be healing in ways that we're not realizing because we've got this really kind of focused point of view about what we think that's going to look like. So asking the question begins to kind of create this more expanded view of being able to see what's actually occurring that perhaps isn't being fully acknowledged. And also something else that you can ask is, what is unintegrated from the healing that I've already had? Because as I've mentioned, like with theta healing sessions, it's the same with energy work as well though. It can be like non-linear. So like if you've gone to a healer and you've had some sort of healing session and it feels like that hasn't been the change that you thought you were going to have, it might be sometimes that there is that unintegrated healing because there's points of view within the subconscious about the time that it's going to take. And so asking that question begins to, it's almost like creating a door to allow, that energy in a little more so that you start to feel what's shifting and changing. So those are the things that you can ask. I hope this has been helpful. If there is anything else that with regards to healing that you have a question about, feel free to leave comments for me. I'm more than happy to answer them. Thank you for listening. If you've got this far, I just thought it was an important thing to share because I think that, healing is such a unique path for each and every one of us because each of us have had very unique journeys. Even though, there are elements of, us all sometimes having lived similar things, there is also uniqueness in all of the things that we've chosen. And so no two healing journeys are the same, and you've got to be willing to let yourself have the journey that you can have and trust yourself and follow your awareness with that. And just know that, sometimes people can be someone that's going to go on that journey with you, and sometimes it might be that you're just going to someone because they can unlock one bit and then you need somebody else to unlock the other bit. So, or it might be that there's a different time frame available. So I hope that clears anything up that has been confusing if you found this video. And yeah, thanks for listening, guys. Bye.